So we've been talking about kind of just some basic foundational stuff. We spent an entire class session on Tuesday, to no one's great excitement, going through about one slide worth of key terms and definitions. I apologize for that. So hopefully we can kind of start picking up speed a little bit as we're going now through the rest of the semester. We're still talking about sort of concepts in terms of definitions, but at least now we have the basic building blocks, just the plain vanilla vocabulary words that we need to start expressing some of these more complex things that you're going to be using as a park ranger or wildland manager or habitat manager, conservation police officer. Any of that stuff relies on this set of concepts pretty hard every day. Whether or not you're talking about it or thinking about it, it's all built up out of this. So let's talk about the development of the concept of leisure. So if we're taking an etymological pathway through this, instead of an entomological one, which would be studying leisure as a bunch of insects, but instead studying them as words, we go back to some earlier cultures like the Romans, and later French culture, out of which we get some concepts of modern-day American culture. Back in the day, 2,000 years ago, up to about 2,400 years ago, the Romans took over, what was then sort of the known world to Western cultures and started to kind of homogenize things quite a bit through the Roman peace, the Pax Romanum. And one big sort of cultural contribution that the Romans made to civilization, they totally stole from the Greeks. More on that later. But there's this idea of you can exist as a human being, but if you exist as a citizen, you have a whole bunch more rights and privileges that include things like not working all day, every day until you die. Things like the concept of leisure. So, licere is where, or licere, depending on the Roman pronunciation. We don't actually know how Latin was pronounced as a dead language, but it's the same word from which we get, or the same etymon from which we get the modern concepts of the word license. So we all have a driver's license, right? Maybe you wonder if who is here have a pilot's license, or are working on that with SIU's aviation school and so forth. And it all sort of boils down to, do you have permission from, in their case, the government, to not work all of the time? So ancient societies before we had machinery, internal combustion engines, or before that steam power, to accomplish a lot of the stuff that we used to do by hand, it was all done by hand, and largely done by the hand of enslaved people or indentured servitude, which are adjacent concepts. Legally there are some differences, but there's a sense of if you are an enslaved person or an indentured servant, your time, your energy, the product of your work is not yours, right? So later on in the Middle Ages, we'll have the idea of serfs, tenant farmers who are tied to the land and who don't really have the legal right or means to not be tenant farmers and so forth. But for everybody who was a Roman citizen, they at least had the opportunity, the license, the permission to not work all the time, which is crazy to us. Like, man, if the LTE or 5G towers go out for like 2 minutes, like people lose their minds these days, right? Like, oh my God, I can't play my Candy Crush. I'm starting to get the shakes, right? Back then it was pretty different. Fast forward about 1,000 years, maybe 1,500 years, to kind of the Renaissance French sense of the idea of what we would call leisure today. And for them, right before the introduction of steam power and internal combustion engines, fossil fuels, stuff like that. More recently, electric, battery powered, solar powered, that kind of stuff. There was a sense of, okay, we don't really engage in human slavery anymore, at least where we can see it in the colonial era. But the royalty, they have time. They have discretionary time. They don't have to do something for somebody else at all times. And later on, with stuff like the French Revolution, this gets imported from French nobility, English nobility, stuff like that, and given to the rest of us. And that's around the time that the United States was created, or at least when the Revolutionary War happened. And so that sense of legal permission to go for a hike on a Sunday afternoon through somebody else's land, maybe, and so forth. And then 1,500 years later, the sense of, okay, I don't have to farm all the time. I have people for that. So I'm going to do stuff like goofy parties. Man, the French royalty went pretty hard on leisure. And now we have our current modern English, American English, Freedom English version of the idea, which goes way beyond just the legal permission to go on a hike. Right? So think about the old Robin Hood story. Not like the Men in Tights Mel Brooks version of my childhood in the 1990s. We're men in tights. We're roaming around the forest looking for fights. The whole premise of the story of Robin Hood is a guy who's illegally living on the king's land as run by the evil Prince John. And Robin Hood steals from the, fill in the blank, steals from the rich and gives to the poor. And the whole reason he's hanging out in Sherwood Forest with Friar Tuck and Will Scarlet and all these guys, and Maid Marian, because they were gender inclusive or something, or just like a token woman, kind of like the Smurfs. There's like one Smurfette. Anyway, 90s were a strange time for cartoons. The whole premise of Robin Hood is that he's living illegally on the king's land, and he accidentally or on purpose gets himself in trouble with the law and lives as an outlaw for shooting one of the king's deer so he could eat after coming back from the Crusades and finding his lands seized by the evil Prince John and so forth, right? So before folks decided to do life in more of an American liberty, personal freedoms way of doing things, there was this idea of like the divine right of kings and emperors, right? So God has put this person on the throne and decreed that their kids are, magically fit to rule and so forth, and it leads to hilarity and lots of people dying in the Black Plague. But we have this sense of, man, you can't even be in some places legally. You can't hunt and put food on your table legally. So if that's your option, you're either starving or breaking the law. That's different from how we understand things now. But this is a concept that has developed in a very particular way from kind of those Roman times and so forth. And we'll get more into detail on the history of it later on. But we didn't magically arrive at this sense of national parks are for you, for me, for everybody. And if we have to charge an entrance fee to help cover the cost of running a national park, it's going to be a nominal fee, $5, $10, something like that. And we're going to support the cost of these places largely otherwise through tax dollars. These are for all of us. You don't need to be born into a specific caste. You don't have to have a certain skin color or have a particular last name or believe in a particular religion or creed or subscribe to any particular political party. They are for you. They are for me. That's a very young concept, and it's a fragile concept worth protecting. So we have to understand that the idea of doing all of this stuff that some of us are thinking about developing a career into is a relatively 105, 110 years old as a concept. and human cultural history goes back at least 17 to 25,000 years, right? So let's, at least as far back as we have evidence archaeologically of things like permanent human settlements. So, for you today, what does the term leisure mean? Just a quick last discussion on that. When we say this term, what comes up? What's the first answer that pops into your head? Don't overthink it. Free time, all right? That checks out.
Relaxation.
Relaxation, okay. So there's hard work, and then there's relaxation, right? Or for some of us, relaxation first, then hard work. That's actually a very old idea. Anybody else? Okay. For me, leisure means ease. Like somebody else is bringing me cooked, delicious foods that's safe to eat, and I'm eating it on like a porch that I didn't have to build, and there's like waves rolling in on property I probably can't afford, you know? Like leisure sounds like a nice, chill trip. Yeah? Okay. So the reason I'm asking about what's your sense of the term leisure is that everybody's sense of it is kind of similar-ish, but not the same. And so when you have a park ranger welcoming up to millions of visitors through your front gate at your national park or other protected area, we got to understand that everybody's coming in with their slightly own or individual idea of what they came to that park for. And that may or may not be sort of coterminous or overlapping with your sense of why you're running that national park and trying to protect it. So, to the extent that there's a good, healthy, workable overlap, all right, we can get some awesome park rangering done. To the extent that we disagree, maybe, like shooting off a bunch of road flares or Roman candles, kind of firework, or shooting guns at piles of tannerite, which is just kind of like a concussively actuated low-grade explosive. So you shoot at it and it goes, it's really lots of fun at gun ranges and stuff like that. For like your gender reveal party, if that is your idea of leisure and the National Park Service is like, whoa, no firearms in our campgrounds, at least no shooting firearms in our campgrounds, because there are lots of other, people around, then that can lead to some conflict or some problems, right? We have people who, it is their legal right and maybe responsibility in the eyes of some to bring their firearms to national parks, but using those is a whole other thing. There's actually a ranger shot at Yellowstone recently, shot and wounded, and that is a very, very rare occurrence relative to the number of people that visit Yellowstone each year. All right, so if we take kind of a more recent historic look through what leisure, free time, the ability to chill plus or minus Netflix, what that's looked like for people kind of in the last century or so, last 80 years, or I guess last 150 years. If you look at the typical work week for somebody who is not like essentially American nobility, right? Independently wealthy, they have folks doing stuff for them. The typical number of work week hours, including stuff like getting up, showering, preparing your food by hand over a wood fire or iron oven, something like that, it's going to cost you about 70 hours a week. So that's what? 14, 15 hours a day, 5 days a week, right? And our typical work week today, on paper, is for a salaried position anywhere between 32 and 40 hours a week. So social scientists put this sort of sequence of U.S. Census questions together on a graph, and this is what we get. With modern mechanization and industrialization, and in the United States and a lot of developed countries, a very, very, very heavy emphasis on public education for all, so that we're not all just manual laborers. We need a lot of manual laborers to make the United States run. Like, we're not second-classing that by any means. We will always need manual laborers and like pipe fitters and welders, people who like actually make things, you know? We are never not gonna need that. But with all of that innovation, with the advent of very, very high energy density fossil fuels and later solar and renewable electric technologies, we can offload a whole lot of that labor. So these days, following World War II and a whole bunch of science and innovation imported from the military, sort of copy-pasted into things like microwave ovens, food preservation technologies, right? So they had to suffer through C rations and K rations and MREs so that we could have things like foil packed tuna that's shelf stable for a decade or more. Like, what kind of bizarre necromantic black magic do you have to have fish meat that's edible for over a decade just sitting on your shelf for when you care to reach for it, right? We import a lot of technology from the space race, which was a low-key military speed competition, speed running, we call it these days in video game culture, to get to the moon versus the Soviets. So that Stalin's Russia didn't beat us in that regard, and that gave us things like Mylar. So low oxygen permeable plasticized, so aluminized plastic films that make things like tuna foil packs shelf stable for 10 years at a time. Okay? So we benefit from all of that technology. A lot of people around the world don't yet have all the benefits of modern technologies and just mind-bendingly powerful and intense economic growth following World War II that folks in the United States have. So that graph isn't true for everybody. In fact, for a couple of billion people, that subsistence plus existence issue is one of on the current day. Okay? So if you think of the Sentinelese, an uncontacted people living on a very small island off the coast of India, where they are living in the late Stone Age, right? They hunt with spears and bow and arrow. If you think of uncontacted tribes in the Amazon, their sense of how to do life is pretty different than yours and mine. Equally valid, but just worlds apart. And much more like the balance of somebody's time in the year 1700 in the United States, or what would become 76 years later, 70 or 80 years later, the United States. Okay, so in the year 1700, social historians have figured out that you're going to spend 12 hours a day, 12 of your 16 or so waking hours a day, on subsistence. And subsistence we're going to define as the stuff you got to do to acquire the capital to keep on living. So it's your gerb, it is your job training, it is stuff like schooling, okay, or apprenticeship back in the 1700s. Where we did not have a public school system set up. You would apprentice under a blacksmith or a cooper or a shoemaker called a cobbler back then, and so forth. Okay? So Paul Revere, you may have heard of him, right? One of the central figures in the early Revolutionary War. He was a silversmith, and so he had apprenticed under somebody else, an older guy, who taught him how to make pretty things out of silver. And he would spend typically, if he's like everybody else, about 2/3 of his waking hours, 12 out of 60, or 3/4 of his waking hours, 12 hours out of 16 waking hours per 24-hour day, on gathering, stacking the lumber, right? Feeding the furnace for the forge, or the whatever smelter he's using to purify and liquefy that silver so he can cast it, or draw it out into wire, beat it into wire, turn it into silver rings, for example, and so forth. Right? It's a lot of work. It takes a lot of time every day to do that stuff. And then we have 11 out of 24 hours a day on existence. Existence, for the purposes of this class, existence time, is going to be classified as what time do you need to pour into sleeping. For most people, statistically on average, it's about 8 hours a day. And in the 1700s, that was highly seasonal, people sleeping a lot more in the winter and less in the summer because there's more sunlight in the summer. Okay. And that leaves 1 hour a day for leisure. And for folks in the 1700s without reliable access to modern healthcare or family planning or birth control, depending on your political alignment currently, you get an hour a day to sit down and be like, all right, kids, go play outside. Because daddy just worked a 12-hour shift again today. And I got like an hour to make breakfast, an hour to make dinner, and then sleep. That's your whole day, that's your whole life. Okay? That's okay. Fast forward to 1950, 250 years later. That leisure slice of the pie, unintended, has quadrupled. Thanks to things like water heaters. I don't have to heat up a bathtub of water once a month or twice a year in the year 1700 to take a bath. And soap that is made out of lye, so rendered fat and fire ash, that is highly caustic and cleans halfway by peeling off layers of skin one by one so you get your outer layer of skin dirty and then you just strip off that layer of skin. Exfoliation. It's horrible. Anyway, lye soap is not great news. That's a quadrupling, right? And almost all of that quadrupling happened in the 50 years prior to 1950, right? So, by the year 1900, almost everybody in the United States, if they have to poop at night, and a lot of people do, they're pooping in a bucket. And they're throwing it out the window in the morning when they wake up, right? That's how people lived for all of human history between the time when we had like buildings and windows and about the year 1900 when the first flush toilets were plumbed and put into place in a widespread way for anybody other than kings and queens. Okay? Or you're pooping in a hole in the ground and burying it when that hole gets full. So, flush toilets, microwaves, things like Band-Aids, or self-adhesive bandages if we don't want to use the brand name, and so forth, right? So major changes. It's like all of human history, and then 1900 hits, and bam, we start shifting things around. And I'm kind of belaboring this super hard. We're 25 minutes in because I'm trying to help everybody understand for all of human existence. Modern humans as a species, if your theology tends in the direction of evolution, modern humans are about 380,000 years old as a species, right? Homo sapiens sapiens. And it's just in the last 120 years that this process has shifted for a lot of people. Not everybody, but a lot of people, okay? Your car, according to a Nobel laureate, Václav Smil, who wrote some really, really thought-provoking stuff, your car gives you the energy equivalent of a couple of hundred human enslaved people in terms of the work that your car allows you to do. To just press an accelerator and rocket down the road at 55 miles an hour, the posted speed limit. Yeah? So think about that. For all of human history up till now, if somebody wanted to travel 65 miles an hour, they didn't. Like, that's not a thing. That's not even physically possible for humans. Not even on a horse, right? Horses top out at around 45, and that's pretty risky and dangerous at that speed. And now we just jump in our cars and it's no big deal. Like, we're putting on our eyeliner or guy liner or whatever, and like in the mirror and like, you know, stick shift and drinking that overpriced latte that was made out of beans flown from South America or sub-Saharan Africa, right? Like, like we enjoy the equivalents, each of us, you and me, of thousands of human slave laborers equivalent because of fossil fuels and now renewable energies. Question, comment?
Comment, because you can kind of see this nowadays in how Europeans don't understand how big America is. Their cities and countries are so much smaller that they think you can go from one side of America to the other in one day.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of an echo of this, as their cities were built that small because they had to be built that small. Otherwise, because nobody could get that far in that small amount of time.
Yeah, so UK, United Kingdom, England, right? There are different titles for different parts of the island system there. Like the size of Illinois, right? And, you know, if you came here from Chicagoland to come to school, for example, that'd be like coming from central Scotland to another country to do school in London on the Thames. Like, we don't have to think about issues of scale. My wife does weekly commutes up to Chicago to do veterinary stuff up there because there's a critical shortage of veterinarians right now. And, like, it's no big deal. She just jumps on the train and she has 6 hours to play video games or, you know, whatever she feels like doing, because the train is doing the equivalent of thousands of people worth of human effort, right? We have this concept of horsepower. I'm talking in terms of human power, right? And for a car to have hundreds of horsepower, horsepower is what, like 700 watts, something like that? Like that's, it's not weird or unremarkable to have a car engine with hundreds of horsepower. And you think farmers, until recently, were using like a horsepower at a time to plow their fields. So now we have this great uplift of surplus energy, surplus calories, and that translates to surplus free time, leisure. So this is what things look like these days. We have the sum total of knowledge and propaganda in our pockets at all times now, the internet. And so, yeah, we work, we play, and we blend those things together. Now, if you don't like your boss, you can take a potty break and pull out your phone and have just a couple of minutes of peace before they jump back on your back and, you know, extract some kind of dollar value out of your labor. And the existence time hasn't changed. We still need something like 8 hours of sleep. A lot of us need 9 hours of sleep. Some of us can function on as few as 3 or 4. And if that's you, man, tell me your secret, because my God. Anyway, so we're all kind of getting this idea that things are not as they once were, and this is unique and exceptional in all of human history, this moment that you are in. Since 2007, when the iPhone first dropped, and replaced the BlackBerry as the preeminent smart device to have, right? Our leisure has changed radically. How many of you guys have played Pokemon Go? Yeah, me too. That launched, anybody know what year that was? 2016. 2016, very good. It was the first game to reach $1 billion in revenue in less than 1 year. And people sat up straight and started paying attention to that at that point. Because billions with a B is 9 zeros after the number. That's a lot. Like that's a lot of space bucks, as they said in Spaceballs, the movie. Okay. So, with that long build-up and preamble, next conversational question: how much free time do you have? In your typical day, as a college student, how much of your time is put towards sleeping and showering and feeding yourself? Existence time. Is that 10-hour pie chart about right? All right, so that leaves us about 14 hours each day to account for it. How many hours are you spending in, I'll be honest, in class, plus studying, plus, if this is you, campus job? Anybody?
About 6 or 7.
6 or 7?
Hmm?
Anybody else? 6 or 7? All right, 6. Cool. So let's round it up to 7. Let's say walking between Lentz and the Ag Building here counts as part of work time because you're obligated to, or maybe you feel a sense of self-imposed obligation to be here in class, learn the stuff that you're here to learn.
Or coming from East Campus.
Or coming from East Campus, a little bit more of a commute, right? That leaves 7 hours a day. That's almost twice as much as like those Dapper Dan hair cream guys and people wearing aprons with the nice white picket fence in 1950. That's almost twice as much leisure time, unobligated time, free time as folks in 1950 had 74 years ago. That's a big jump. That's like a quadrupling for them, and then almost doubling again for you. That's pretty good. So do you feel like you have the benefits of enjoying 7 hours of leisure time every day? How's that going for you? Does it feel like it?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. So this is where we might start to see some fraying in agreement, right? So, okay. Yeah. I mean, you do eventually got to do that stuff, right? Not every day, but
Yeah, that's what I think.
okay. Any of you guys, I don't know if this is actually a thing anymore. Does D2L send you guys like notifications if we post an announcement on the course website or anything? Does it like ping your phone or anything? Send it to your email, okay. Right on.
So you gotta remember to check it.
Right on. I hope, I'm not going to ask, I hope that none of your professors are in the habit of like sending out all caps text messages with lots of exclamation points, as boomers do. And I'm including myself now. I'm a millennial, 2 generations lower than that, but I'm old, right? So hopefully your professors aren't like reaching into that leisure time and harshing your mellow by interrupting whatever flow you're in at that time, right? But we can now. Hopefully most of us choose not to. Like, there's this sense of this blending, both providing more leisure time, 7 hours according to this class, but also blending work into the leisure as well as blending leisure into the work, right? So if your parents or guardians or foster carers or whatever, if they have ever talked about like having to, you know, put their phones on airplane mode during a vacation so that their boss can't, you know, call them, send them emails, keep them on call low-key, keep them on the leash. This is what they're talking about. The blending of subsistence time, work time, and leisure. And with smartphones, that is a much more messy gradient than before, okay? So then it was considered free time, unobligated time, nobody telling you what to do, or another way to say that is discretionary time. These days, it's more like, well, it's a lot more specifically and specially developed. So let's jump into the next thing. We'll kind of end on our next idea here. All right.